I think there's something really interesting going on in Christianity. Theologically, I think it's called salvation. Psychoanalytically, I think it's called the cure. And politically, you might want to call it socialism.
I guess it's like trails and blazes with the map getting lost, sticking labels or lists on. Fake ladies and males get their shit on, made up and murdered like women gliding with their wings gone.
Hey, what is going on? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori. I just realized, dude, our opening tagline that we studied philosophy, politics, and religion, why do we have that in the past tense?
Study politics, philosophy. I don't know. There's some sort of sign value in making it seem like we've already accomplished everything in our theoretical and academic pursuits.
Yeah,
maybe
probably. It's like degrees on the wall type thing.
That's right. They're hanging. We have our degrees hanging on the wall already. We are done. We're not reading anymore. We're not furthering our education. We have reached the summit, and now we're going to distill our information for you people.
I'm sorry, I just ruined the opening of our podcast.
So this week I'm stoked. We have on philosopher, heretic theologian. He's going to get angry, but I called him a pastor, and he corrected me and got uncomfortable, but all around wonderful creative thinker, and I don't know what else you would call him, but he's amazing.
You call him Peter Rollins, right?
Peter Rollins is on the podcast, and we're going to talk about Christianity and psychoanalysis and the death of God, and what does it even mean to kind of use the word Christianity in a different context, and how can you align yourself with the tradition of Christianity without necessarily having to fall into the sort of the trappings that are generally offered by the confessional discourses that we are mostly accustomed to. And similarly, could you be an atheist? What does the word atheist mean? But in a different context. So we're going to delve into that, and it'll be a lovely chat. Also, a reminder, our Patreon is live, and we have got a couple bonus episodes that are out there. New ones, I should say. We've got probably a back catalog of like 6 or 7 of them now. But 2 new ones. One is a conversation with myself and a buddy, Alex, where we talk about kind of hedonism and beer and food and socialism and why Denmark is so fucking cool and a couple other things like that. And then actually it'll be a perfect supplement to this podcast because I just finished recording it, and they will be live around the same time. But it's a conversation with a buddy of mine named Tim Levens, who is a scholar on messianism and who did a lot of work on Derrida and Benjamin and the idea of what is called messianicity without messianism. So it's basically, how can we understand the expectations for a Messiah, for a transformation of the world to come, but within a context that is explicitly non-religious?
It's like Coke Zero. It's Coke without Coke.
Or is it the real Coca-Cola, and that actually Christianity is Coke Zero or Diet Coke?
Decaffeinated coffee. Same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What is the thing that Zizek talks about? Is it coffee without caffeine, or
decaf remember. Coffee? It's coffee without the constitutive element. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So if you are interested in getting access to those bonus episodes, go over to patreon.com/owlsatdawn, and you can get access to those bonus episodes as well as access to the newsletter, where Troy and I give you a little bonus sticky leave stuff and shitty minute stuff, as well as some links to articles that we have read that are really tickling our fancy, and books that we are reading at the moment as well. And that comes out monthly for patrons. Speaking of which, we got to get into the real constitutive element of the podcast and the newsletter and my life. It's the shitty minute, man. It's the moment of the podcast where one of us gets to relieve themselves and vent their frustrations about what it is that is bothering them in the world. Troy, you're up to bat, man. What's up?
All right, so here's my shitty minute. I was reading an article by bioethicist named Neil Levy on the phenomenon of cochlear implants. So are you familiar with cochlear implants? These implants you can put in usually infants that are deaf to enable them to hear.
Yeah, and it's not just infants either. My ex-girlfriend's brother lost his hearing when he was a teenager, and he got cochlear implants when he was early 20s, I think, or something like that. So it can happen at that age as well.
Right, yeah, it can happen for adults too. It's mainly an issue for infants, though, ethically, because obviously they can't make their own choices.
Oh, okay, I got it. The ethical issue. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so the basic kind of debate is not super important to this, but I want to just summarize it really quickly, just to set the whole thing up, is whether or not we should sort of ban cochlear implants for infants. Because the idea is if these kinds of things are available, then every parent will give their deaf infants cochlear implants, and that will mean the inevitable end of deaf culture. And so it's almost like accidental cultural genocide. Since deaf culture has its own language and its own literature and its own sort of cultural space, cochlear implants would mean the end of that culture eventually, within a few decades. And so there's a debate about, in other contexts, we're not okay with, destroying a culture, even accidentally. So why would we allow that here? And so that's like the ethical question, right? And it's a really interesting debate, and I found it very sort of illuminating to think about. But in addition to this whole debate thing, I found out about this phenomenon which I think I already kind of knew existed, and I think exists because you've responded or talked about these things sometimes. It's the phenomenon on YouTube of recording people who are getting their cochlear implants and then their incredible emotional reactions to first hearing sound.
Right. Yeah, I've never seen that one, but I've seen the ones with like babies who get glasses for the first time and they can see their moms, or like people who are colorblind and they get those special glasses and they can see colors and stuff like that.
Yeah. Didn't you send me the one of the guy who's like in his 60s and his family for his birthday or something gets him these glasses where he can see color and he just freaks out?
Yeah, and he's like this big bodybuilder dude and he just gets all super emotional and gets all excited. And yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. And so I was made aware of this phenomenon, right? And I was also made aware of a apparently pretty common critique from a philosopher who I'm not going to name for reasons that will be apparent if you knew who this was. But that these kinds of things are bad, these kinds of videos, the phenomenon of these things, because they're basically like pornographizing cochlear implants. So basically it's like, that I can't remember what the context was of this story, but there's some scientific study from back in the day where they were able to sort of program a hamster to be able to press a lever, and when it pressed a lever, it caused some mechanism that released dopamine in the hamster's brain. And since since the hamster was able to kind of hack its own reward mechanism, it just pressed the button like as many times as possible until it flooded its brain and died.
Yeah. That's
like
amazing.
It's a great metaphor for like the death drive, right?
100%.
And so I guess the argument was something kind of like that, where we're just taking this thing that brings us pleasure, which should be rare, like watching some fantastic miracle happen, and then we're just like pressing the button over and over and over again, just watching videos over and over again of this miracle happening. And so we've made it into pornography, right? This like sexual thing, which should be special and intimate, where it's becoming like this, constant, like every moment thing where we have to have the pleasure. And I was just like, holy shit, man. What the fuck is up with leftists and academics having to ruin everything good? Like, why does everything, like, of course, is that kind of true? Yeah, it's kind of true, right? I get it.
It is.
But don't just like, it's like it's their death drive. They're pressing the lever infinity times until the hamster dies, is ruining other people's fun and other people's happiness. Like, that's their version of it. And so I'm just like, bro, sis, chill the fuck out for a minute. And I just like, let people be kind of happy. Like, good things are good. Yeah, nothing's purely good, but just chill the fuck out with pointing out the little piece of shit in the hamburger that's otherwise delicious.
Right. Yeah. You know what it was, dude? I just remembered. It was actually in your apartment when I was in California that I showed you the video.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was when I was just there this past September. And we all sat around and we watched the video, and I got
we all sat around and watched porn together. That's pretty gross.
Hey, man, it's a communal activity, whatever. Here's the thing. Like, I get it. From a critical and analytical perspective, is there some merit to what this philosopher is saying? Yeah, there is. But at the same time, I think he or she is also neglecting the potent sight of like affective transformation that occurs when people experience joyful encounters. For example, like we did around a cell phone, kind of sharing in something. We created some sort of affective bond. And while it might not be something that, like, that moment in your apartment, that one night, like, changed my life forever, it created some sort of micro psychobiological shift. And the more micro psychobiological shifts that we can, like, chain together, like, you can kind of actually, you do change yourself. And if you can, like, string together habitual streams of affective transformation, then you can actually kind of like change your, psychobiological framework. And I think that stuff matters for what it is that we're doing, because our psychobiological frameworks are constantly being assaulted, and they're constantly being imposed upon, and they're kind of they're being nudged, if you will, in the language of like behavioral economics, into different directions. So it's yeah, there's some bad to it, but simultaneously it's a pharmacon, right? With every poison there's also a cure, or vice versa. Every cure is a poison. So there's like an interesting pharmacological critique here that we could engage in as well. So it's not just bad.
Yeah, and just to break down the analogy with porn a little bit more, like I don't share the video of porn with my mom, but I'll share the cochlear implant video because it's kind of beautiful, right? Why do you do that? Well, because one is just about like your purely internal libidinal, drive, right? And that can easily get corrupted and become, self-destructive and whatnot, right? But then, yeah, can the cochlear implant videos and stuff, can they be the same way? I guess they can eventually be kind of destructive in some way. But come on, that's just pointing out one really superficial similarity and then just kind of blowing it out of proportion. Like, just relax a little bit. If someone's in their room watching 7 hours of videos of people who are getting cochlear implants and like getting, libidinal, happiness and joy out of it, and you're like sweating the whole time and like needing like extra socks or whatever. Okay, there's an issue, but that's probably not what's happening.
Right. Well, I mean, if we're going to bemoan the pornification of society, which is something that the philosopher Byung-Chul Han talks about, and I actually love his articulation of this, I don't think that that's where we should really target our efforts. Like that stuff is good because it's providing some sort of joy and connecting us to community and showing us like some of the brilliant things that technology can do. And I think that that's something that's different. Let's direct our attention to the things that are destructive, that are also engaged in a similar type of logic. So it's not just that, let's say, pornification and like exposure to these things like in an unbridled sense itself is problematic, but it's what's problematic is towards what end or in what direction does that pornification take place? And if it's taking place within the direction of like solidarity and connecting humans together and sharing joy and things like that, I'm not sure that we should really bemoan that. Let's like bemoan the other systems, the ones that kind of like, I don't know, cause dissatisfaction and cause isolation, like Instagram selfies where you're sitting there and then self-flagellating yourself because you're constantly beating yourself up because you don't look like an Instagram model. Like, that's the stuff. That's the pornification that we should look at that's detrimental. Right?
Which is also purely internal, right? That's the kind of thing you do in your room by yourself in order to produce massive anxiety. Yeah, that's much better analog.
Yeah. So I want to know who the philosopher is. You got to tell me off air.
Maybe I'll keep it a secret.
Maybe. All right, sweet. So now we're going to jump into our main segment, and I'm really excited to have our next guest on. His name is Peter Rollins. He is a theologian, pastor, heretic, heterodox thinker. I don't really know how to describe him. He is in many ways somebody who was a big influence on me when I was coming out of my undergrad years. And he is currently... He travels the world and speaks about theology, but from a perspective I think that will be very fascinating for our audience. And so I reached out to him, and he was so gracious to accept the invitation to come on and chat with us this week. So this is Peter Rollins. Say hello.
So, should I say hello? Hello, how's it going? I was very nervous when you called me a pastor. or even a theologian. My training is in philosophy, and I don't know if I'm a pastor or not. Maybe to some people, but I would be worried about being a pastor to anybody. I think I would just screw up everybody's lives if I was a pastor.
See, that's the kind of humility that we like to have. He's making jokes already, and he's already deferring, and he's uncomfortable. This is exactly what we like in our non-pastor,
It's a story of my life.
non-theologians.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be on the show, by the way, guys. I love the fact that I'm talking to two people who have got a love of philosophy, and I usually don't get a chance to do as many podcasts as I would like. But the fact that you guys contacted me and I looked at all of the things you talk about, I was very excited to be a guest on the podcast. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Cool. Yeah, our pleasure. I mean, just to start things off, I want to say that you one time you said something one time that has resonated in my ears, and I can't shake it, and I still repeat it, and sometimes I forget where I get it, and so I've kind of like cribbed it from you. But when I'm in my more honest moments, then I'm like, oh, I heard this dude one time say this thing that has profoundly impacted me, and it was something along the lines of, and the way that I always tell it is, people will be like, oh, so you're an atheist, or you reject God, or that you reject the resurrection. And I say, yeah, I do reject the resurrection. Every time I walk by somebody that's homeless, that's in need, or every time I refuse to engage in some sort of liberatory struggle, or every time I find myself siding with something that is not aiming towards the ends of liberation or emancipation or something along those lines. But then I said, but sometimes I do affirm the resurrection, and it's those times when I do find myself engaged in those types of activities. Do you remember saying that or using that type of framing?
In fact, I remember the very first time I used it. It was actually at a debate in Calvin College in Michigan. And I was on this panel, and it was about philosophy and theology. And it was weird because I kind of thought that this question would come up at some point, that at some point somebody would maybe ask me the question of, did I affirm the literal resurrection or whatever? And I remember it was interesting because the room was very divided. There were people who were conservative in the room, and there were people who were more liberal who were in the room. And it was typical of these academic conferences. You kind of side with the person on the panel who's most closely associated with your position. And whenever I got asked this question, I used that answer. It just came to me in the moment. I was like, well, listen, actually, you know what? I can't say that I affirm the resurrection just looking at my life. And I talked about that. And then I said, but there are moments whenever I do affirm the resurrection, and that is whenever I reach out to my neighbor. Those are the few moments when I affirm life by listening to the cry of the other, that I respond to that cry of the other. And what was interesting was at that moment, there was no divide in the room. It was one of those beautiful moments, probably actually the most beautiful moment I've ever had as a speaker. It was that rare moment when all of us were like, yeah, I can get alongside that. Didn't matter if you were conservative or liberal, whether you defined yourself as more progressive or more traditional. It was like everybody in the room went, yeah, actually, that probably gets to the core of what it means to affirm the resurrection. And I was very pleased with that. So it's probably the best thing I said. If I died the next day, I would have been happy rather than saying a whole pile of crap after that,
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the reason too that it's such an impactful statement is that it kind of shifts what most people think faith is, especially in American Western evangelical contexts, which is all about like intellectual assent to doctrinal beliefs, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's much more about really what we believe is what we do, right? Which I think, and I know that Troy and I have talked about this, is actually in the Bible. I mean, James makes this pretty clear in the Bible. But we are so accustomed to a theological tradition that is based on doctrinal formulations That it's like, especially after, I mean, I don't know, Troy might be more familiar with this than me, but like I would say that especially after like the emergence of the fundamentalist movement, where it's like, we believe X, Y, and Z, not that there haven't been doctrinal beliefs and that people weren't fucking killed because of bad doctrinal beliefs that were laid down in the dogma, but it seems that it's all about kind of like carving out these specific epistemological points to either affirm or deny with the mind, and that it's much less about recognizing that actually that stuff is really secondary. What you really believe is what you do, and you are kind of just stopping and saying, "Fuck, man, what do I believe? I don't really know what I believe, but I guess if I look back in my life, you can tell what I believe based on how I've lived my life and how I live my life, and you kind of just stop there and say that's what we should be worried about."
Well, there's one thing I would love to do is to just nuance it slightly, because I totally agree with you, and especially actually my first book, I was very, very taken by the idea that what we believe is seen in our actions. The only nuance that I would like to bring to that, which comes from my influence, the influence that psychoanalysis has had on me, is that even our actions can be deceptive. You know, you can act in certain ways that aren't true to your inner life. For example, you might be nice to somebody, but really you're just doing that to create a good image of yourself or something like that. So interestingly, even beliefs can be very deceptive. We can, even to ourselves, like I can act in certain ways and only years later come to realize that the way I was acting was hiding something about myself that even I didn't realize. So in psychoanalysis, the idea is that the truth is not in what you say, and it's not in what you do in your regular practice. What you believe is found in your parapraxis. And what that means is like, so parapraxis is like paramilitary. A parapraxis is a type of practice that is outside the authority of your consciousness. It's outside of your ego, which is basically the symptom. So what that means is that it's the very things that you do when you're not aware of them, the things that you do when you're least aware. Those are the things that tell the truth about what's going on inside you and your desires. And I like that because it's almost like, it's like a teacher who gives some extra help to a pupil, and they don't even think about it. They don't even reflect on why they're doing it. A pupil just needs help, and they just instinctively do it without thinking about it. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And I think that is, in a sense, the most authentic type of action, a type of action that is almost, it sounds weird to say, this is very Derridean actually. It's a type of action that happens behind our back, that it's like a heart beating or a bird singing. It is the type of action we do that catches us unaware. But anyway, I just thought I'd add that.
Didn't Zizek once tell a story about, maybe it was a movie or a novel or something, where there's some kids who are engaging in sort of altruistic behavior, but they're totally unaware of the fact that they're doing it, and they're not doing it because of some principles that they've sort of inculcated or developed through, through like rational processes or anything, and that is totally is dumbfounding to a character in the story, and they're trying to figure out why these people would just naturally do these actions without any regard for their purpose.
Yes, with no care. Yes.
Yeah. Did Zizek tell a story about that at some point in one of his million books?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it sounds very Zizekian anyway, and it's very much a psychoanalytic idea that it's a type of action that doesn't seek anything. That's not even. It's basically a symptom. But Derrida says it beautifully when he talks about the gift. For Derrida, he does a thought experiment, which you probably know, where he goes, what's the perfect gift? And he starts off by saying, well, you know what, if I give you guys a gift, if after this podcast I think, oh, that was really nice, I'm gonna buy you a concert ticket or something. Well, that's great, but you get the gift, you think that I'm wonderful, you're all thankful to me, so I get something in return. So it's kind of economic. I'm trying to be nice, but actually I get to feel great, right? So Derrida says, well, what if you give a gift and the person doesn't know that you gave it. So maybe I send you an anonymous concert ticket. I'm not going to do this, by the way, so don't hold your breath. But I send you an anonymous box of chocolates, like the old milk tray adverts. Now, that's better because I can't get you guys thinking I'm amazing because you don't even know I gave you the gift. But I can still think that I'm amazing. I still come away from that going, I'm a fantastic person. So again, it's economic. So Derrida then goes, well, what about giving a gift that the people don't know you've given it, and they don't know you've given it. You don't know that you've given it, and nothing actually has been given. Right? He says that would be the perfect gift because there's no economic response. You don't get anything back. And you go, well, what would that look like? But then you kind of think about something like forgiveness, where if I forgive you guys for being assholes to me, I don't even have to tell you. I don't have to phone you up and say I'm forgiving you because that would be ridiculous, right? I can just forgive you. And maybe if it's just a natural response in me, I don't even think about it myself. Yeah. And so for Derrida, it's almost like the perfect gift is invisible. You never see them because the gifts are happening all the time, but always behind our back. And that is potentially the type of a type of moral act.
Mm. Could we broaden that out even into a social context? So, like in the United States, there's the debate raging about the welfare state and whether or not we should cut entitlements or expand entitlements, right? Whereas if you look at Norway, for example, or Denmark, they don't even ask the question because it's just presumed. So if you grow up in Denmark as a child, let's say, immersed in that world, you're just swimming in the sea, like this is water. You're not even aware that you live in a society that is taking care of your basic needs, that you actually have access to healthcare and things like that. So it becomes the gift that is given, but without it actually being a gift because it's disinterested. It's just kind of there. But the problem in the United States is they can't even accurately engage in the discussion because it's all framed in this discussion of the viability of the gift, and it's all economic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so weirdly, you get this system where ethics is even divorced from being nice. I see this all the time in Belfast. So I'm from Northern Ireland, and we're a tough bunch, the Northern Irish, right? But it was a few months ago, I was back in Belfast, and I went into a shoe shop. And I went into the shoe shop because I had to go to this wedding, and I just come back from this gig, and I was unshaven. I looked a mess. I had these shoes that were falling apart, and I went in and I gave them to the guy, took them off and said, can you do something to fix these? Just fix this damage and give them a clean. And he looked at it and he was really grumpy and he was basically telling me to piss off. But he was like, listen, okay. So he took them, he worked on them for about half an hour, totally, a grumpy old man, threw the shoes back at me. And then I brought out my wallet to pay for it. He said, I'm not going to take your money. Just go away. Right. And I thought, that is the gift. Like he's like giving me this free gift, but there's no niceness about it. But he would never even consider taking money for such a small thing. And that he refused to take the money. So it was, that for me was a Derridean gift and one of my closest friends is very grumpy as a person, but he just acts morally all the time. It's quite beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things that's so funny is that even, especially in the United States, is that everything has to be like some sort of psychic exchange, right? Like I have now lived abroad off and on for the last 9 years, and the service industries outside of the United States are very different. Like you don't have waiters that come up with doing the performance. I mean, you guys are both in LA. I'm from LA. I was a waiter in LA, so I know the game. I mean, and I grew up as an actor, so I was all about the performance, Yeah. But when you go to these other countries, a lot of times they're not working for tips. So that level of psychic reciprocity doesn't impinge on them so much. They're not playing for the smile and for the enjoyment. Whereas in the United States, it goes so deep that in every act of exchange, you always have to be there always has to be this performance of a smile or a recognition, I thank you for the thing, or even in refusing the reciprocity, you have to be like, no, of course you don't have to do that for me. It was my pleasure. And then you're sitting there like, well, fuck, it was your pleasure. So now you're excited and I don't have the same level of affect that you have. So then there's still an imbalance here. So there's
Yeah.
like this constant battle between reciprocal relations.
Yes, I'm always worried when people are too nice. And it's partly because I'm from, as I say, Belfast and lived in New York for a while. So I'm always very nervous whenever someone's very nice to me. I always think there's some immorality going on here somewhere. Yeah, because I remember one of my friends who he got money out of a bank and the teller gave him an extra £50 by accident. And he got home and he realized, and he just went straight back, gave her the money. But he was totally pissed off about it. Didn't wait for any thanks. Just go like, "You're an idiot. Here you go," right? And then walked away. And I was like, again, it was an ethical act with no desire for thank you, with no desire to try to seem like a nice person or to get thanks. He was grumpy. He was annoyed, but he didn't consider doing anything but bringing it back, because for him that woman might lose her job. Like at the end of the day, she might lose her job because she gave him too much money. Whereas somebody might be very, very nice in their everyday life, but if they got that extra £50, they would just very happily pocket it, even if it cost somebody their job.
Do you guys think that there's a possibility that sort of the liberal side of the aisle, sort of the mainstream liberal side of the aisle, might learn the wrong lesson from what we're talking about in terms of the importance of niceness and demeanor, and that sometimes there's this idea that, as we're saying, niceness has an immorality behind it, so therefore we should just be dicks all the time.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so it just seems to me that that's sometimes the lesson learned, and that seems to not be the proper lesson, and that there's something about doing the actual ethical action devoid of any sort of constitutive role for the demeanor is the important point. And the wrong lesson to learn is just to do the opposite demeanor.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's a real problem with the lack of civility. The lack of, for me, something I learned when I studied philosophy is that to try to interpret the person you're reading or you're engaging with in a sympathetic way, partly so that you can, find something interesting in what they're saying and also engage with them. And so there is a certain level of a hermeneutics of love, maybe, or a hermeneutics of grace whenever you're reading or listening to somebody that's important. And so I think you're putting your finger on a real problem today, is that sometimes we can really disregard the other and be impolite and be closed off to the other in the name of justice and morality. That can be a problem.
I'm glad you bring up the principle of charity, though, because I can see to flip it on the other side. In analytic philosophy circles, they teach about the principle of charity, but it's not even sort of hidden behind the curtain that the reason you're charitable to whoever it is that you're writing about or discussing is so that you can even better critique them. Because once you're charitable, they have nothing left to respond to your critique with other than to be devastated.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's like a preparation to stab them.
Yes. So that's a beautiful way of saying it. I mean, whenever I'm just arguing with somebody, I want to describe their position in a way that they fully go, "You've got me. You understand what I'm saying. You appreciate it." And then I can do the devastating, and here's where you're wrong, right? And I think that's a very effective way of arguing that we learn in the academy, and that I think we learn for good reason.
So, what does this have to do with Christianity? Do you even think that the signifier of Christianity is worthwhile? If parapraxis is something that you think is maybe a more accurate depiction of the human predicament, how does this fit into Christianity, and why do you use words like theology still to describe pyrotheology, which is something that you are developing and a practice that you are engaging in?
Yeah.
Why even use those terms, and does it matter?
Well, I mean, maybe one of the main reasons why I use those terms is because they're incredibly uncool, and I kind of like that. I like using a discourse that is pretty much universally seen as ridiculous. It allows you a little bit of freedom, and so it's not just that, but I love, like, theology in the academic world is the runt, and for good reason sometimes, because a lot of what goes under the name of theology sounds like magic school or like you're going to Hogwarts, right? It's how to create the magic spells, and it's all ridiculous. But there is a I think there is a real strength within some theology, and I'm interested in that. And actually, I think some of these old, very uncool terms like original sin, like forgiveness or grace, or even trying to think of other terms, but like original sin is a very good one. That actually, at the very moment when progressive Christians and liberal Christians want to distance themselves from these kinds of notions, uh, there's something deeply profound, that they capture a reality that that can be lost in what I would say is basically a non-theological reading of the Bible, which is, a nice guy stood up against injustice and got killed. Like that's an interesting way of reading the Gospels, but it doesn't get to the meat of it. I think there's something really interesting going on in Christianity that influenced like existentialism, that influenced psychoanalysis, that's part of the European intellectual tradition. And I want to recover that. So that's part of my work. And part of my work is saying that there is a form of Christianity that transcends atheism and theism, that's beyond the sacred secular divide, that is an invitation into a form of life that frees us from the frenetic pursuit of the increase of capital. For example, that there's a critique of the contemporary political world, hard baked into the Christian story. Now that's a lot to unpack because I've kind of shown you my answer, but not my working out. So yeah, we might want to delve into that. But I suppose that's my claim.
Hmm.
I mean, very key to this, by the way. I mean, you mentioned Zizek earlier. Slavoj Zizek has really brought theology, some of the power and the importance of theology, back into the academic mainstream. So I mean, my work is very close to the work of Zizek, and Zizek's been very influential in the development of pyrotheology.
Why do you appropriate the term heretic, Peter? I'm kind of curious about that.
Well, again, I did it whenever it was a bad word, and sadly now it's not a bad word. Now people use it in church all the time, so it's like it's lost part of its power. But I mean, Christianity is heresy. I mean, it's not like in the sense of the eruption of Christianity was the eruption of a critique and a countercultural, subversive community that was attempting to move beyond the distinctions of the day: Jew, Gentile, slave, free, male, female. It was trying to create a community that moved beyond these rigid identity markers, that was oriented to the least among us, that saw the sacred or the absolute or the truth in the least among us. And so there is something about Christianity that I think is inherently heretical. And I just want to rediscover what that is.
Hmm. I'm thinking a lot about Derrida and his notion of messianicity without messianism here. And we actually are going to have a bonus episode coming out on this, talking with a friend of mine who was, he's like a scholar of messianism. And that's kind of one of the things, and it's not really in my wheelhouse, but it's something that I've been slowly introducing myself to. Is that kind of where you derive some of your work from? Is his work on the idea of messianism, but it's like a religionless religion? Because you talked about, before we were recording, you talked about John Caputo and how he was an influence on you as well. And it's this idea of weak messianism, or messianicity without messianism, or like a non-messianic messiah, something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess my intellectual influences, the first major philosopher who really grabbed me was probably Heidegger. Was the first kind of like major philosopher whose work really got into my head. Then it was probably the existentialists. I was particularly influenced by a guy called Gabriel Marcel, who's not a very well known existentialist, but was an important figure. And then from that into the work of Derrida. Derrida was very much probably an important influence in my first book. And in terms of this idea of the messianic, this is just for your listeners. It's the notion that for Derrida, okay, let's try to put this in a nutshell. For Derrida, there is the law. The law is what we try to write down, what justice is. Every time we try to articulate what democracy is, what justice is, what love is, we kind of make it into a document. And every time we do that, that falls short of the very thing that we're speaking of. Every time we try to define love, we'll misdefine it. Every time we try to write down what justice is, some case will come up that will break down our notion of what justice is. That's why the legal system has to always be changing and adapting, because new situations arise. And so Derrida calls this the undeconstructible. And so what happens is we write down the law, we try to write down and define what justice is and democracy is, but every time we do it, we are unfaithful to it, we miss it. There's something about democracy that we can't quite grasp. But without writing it down, we would have no ability to speak of it at all. So we have this weird thing that the law is not justice, but the law is the only way we can speak about justice. So in a way, the law is inspired by this desire to articulate what love and justice is, but it will always fail in that endeavor. So there is this messianic dimension where we're always longing for the incoming of justice. We're always trying to improve our definitions and our understanding. But that is a never-ending process. So we're always waiting for the Messiah of justice and love to enter into the world. That longing influences how we live in the world, but we can never become arrogant enough to think that we can define it. I guess if I was a Buddhist, I would say it's, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, which is the kind of the idea of the Buddha is always to come. As soon as someone says, I am the articulation of the Buddha, then in a sense, by definition, it's not the Buddha. The Buddha is beyond all concretized historical manifestations of the Buddha. Did that make it clear or more unclear?
Troy, I think it was pretty clear, but I've kind of been deep into this stuff for the past little while. So
yeah, I know that's the worry. We could get into inside baseball very easily here.
Yeah. Yeah, because obviously I'm thinking now about Kafka's parable. Was it called Before the Law?
Oh yes.
At the end of the trial.
Yeah, exactly. And it's this. So for people that don't know, it's about this guy who. It's a parable that's told to Kay in the trial, and it's about this guy who's outside this gate, and there's a gatekeeper there. And is it that the gate is the law in the parable? Is that right?
It's the gate to the law, I think, isn't it?
It's the gate to the law. That's right. And his entire life is lived at the gate with the promise being held over him that he would get into the gate, but he never gets into the gate and he ends up dying outside of the gate, right? Mm. And Derrida kind of takes this, and he has a couple of essays, I think, that he's written on it, and exactly what Peter just elaborated. And it's this idea that that there's this deferral, which then kind of we could tie into Derrida's notion of difference that he develops earlier. But there's this deferral, this constant like receding promise of satisfaction or promise of some sort of culmination that you never actually get to. But it's the barrier itself that kind of creates the relationship between the promise and the barrier itself. So it's like in a step. And so I'm thinking of psychoanalysis, Lacan's, the idea of the objet petit a as the sort of object cause of desire. Todd McGowan's work has been really influential in me over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I have to say.
And he wrote a book called Capitalism and Desire. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I have to say that I find his work phenomenally good. I really love his work. So yeah, anyway, keep going.
Well, yeah, I mean, Capitalism and Desire, and for me is like the richest way for me to understand the logic of capitalism as establishing the limits, and in the establishment of the limits, it's holding over for you this this promise of satisfaction, that promise that you will be satisfied. But all it can ever give to you is the limits, right? And it's the limits that actually cause your desire. And it feels like there's something similar going on here with this idea of the Messiah, or this weak messianism that you're kind of discussing as well. Yeah?
Yeah, and the key is, and this is where actually I'm more Lacanian now than Derridean maybe, but is that my current work is very much interested in this idea of the obstacle. And there's basically for me two ways in which we can relate to this obstacle. One of them is we're always deferring our satisfaction. There's always something just over the horizon that promises completeness. And, we're unhappy if we don't get it, but we're also unhappy if we do get it. Because so if we're imagining, a certain amount of money that will satisfy us, or a certain sexual partner, or a certain job or level of fame, we have this fantasy of the thing that's going to fix everything. That's the kingdom of God, right? And LA is the most religious place in the world, because every corner has a prophet saying that you can be whole and complete if only you do the right yoga poses, do CrossFit, or get enough money, or whatever it is. So there's this promise, and it makes us dissatisfied when we don't get it. But if we ever do get it, it's even worse, because we realize that it doesn't fix the lack that's part of being human. So this is what's called the drive in psychoanalysis, which is, capitalism is a good example, where you just want to increase capital without end, right? There's no limit to the increase of capital. You make 1 million, then you make 5, you make 50, you make 100 million. If you give yourself over to it, you will just put yourself in an early grave, seeking more and more and more. But then there's a healthy way of dealing with this as well, which is where you realize that actually the satisfaction and enjoyment of life is actually in the struggle, not in getting the fantasy that you're imagining, but in struggling for it. So that's the healthy side of this. And that's more, I think, what Derrida is about exploring how we can, I guess it's like this, the conservative, the kingdom of God for the conservative is in the past, the golden age. Make America great again is a great conservative slogan. Divorcing it from Trump for a second, just the idea that in the past there was the kingdom of God, the perfect, peaceful thing existed. In religion, it's like before the fall, or maybe you imagine your childhood was innocent, or that last person you went out with was amazing and you wish you could get it back. The revolutionary, the kingdom of God is in the future. It's eschatological. It's something that we're fighting for. And the problem for the revolutionary is if ever they get the utopia they're fighting for, they're often the first against the wall, and it is often a disaster. But for Albert Camus, who I really like as a writer, he talks about the rebel. And the rebel is different from the conservative and different from the revolutionary, because the rebel is the one who enjoys the struggle. They enjoy being an outsider. They still fight for a better world, but the enjoyment is not in the fantasy that, one day we'll get there. The enjoyment is actually in the pursuit itself. And Marlon Brando is the most famous rebel in the movie The Wild Ones, where he's part of the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and he goes into this coffee shop, and this waitress says to him, "Johnny, what are you rebelling against?" And Johnny smiles at her and says, "What do you got?" He just, you can tell that he loves it. He is enjoying his outsider status. And that's, I think, so the rebel is in a sense as the messianic, as the kingdom of God is within you. It is in the struggle for a better world you are actually experiencing a depth of life.
This is really interesting. I think when you were talking about this sort of double bind that contemporary culture, American culture at least, puts us in, between seeking after desires and either not satisfying them and being frustrated, or satisfying them and realizing it's not actually satisfactory. It reminds me, I've been reading Adam Kotsko's Neoliberalism's Demons lately, and he has this concept of demonization, where he compares sort of the story of the fall of Satan, where God basically, according to sort of the, at least more conservative interpretation, creates the demons in order for them to fall, to then blame them for what they do. In the same way,
Yeah.
so they're kind of they have this double bind where they kind of have to fall for the sake of it, but then they get blamed for it. In the same way, capitalism kind of creates this double bind for us, where it tells us we have to do these things, and then blames us for making the choice when it was the only choice we could have made anyway, given the cultural logic of the system. And that
Yeah.
because it's a double bind, the only really logical way to deal with it is to get out of it. Either choice you
Yes.
make is dooming you to fail.
Yeah, and this is for me what salvation is. Well, theologically, I think it's called salvation. Psychoanalytically, I think it's called the cure. And politically, you might want to call it socialism. I don't know, but it is a way of actually libidinally disinvesting yourself from the mechanism of desire that keeps our society going. And that's what I think the church is at its best. I'm not talking about what the church is and what you see at the end of your street, but I'm talking about micro societies of resistance that allow you to unplug your libidinal investment in this unhealthy drive, where if you don't get what you want, you lose. And if you do get what you want, you also lose. It's kind of like what Schopenhauer says when he says human beings oscillate between boredom and suffering. So suffering is basically the sadness of not getting what you want, and boredom is the sadness of getting what you want. So we basically oscillate between melancholy and depression. We live in a society where the poor lose doubly, but even the wealthy lose. That's the funny thing, is weirdly in a system where the losers lose horribly, but even the winners come out with deep levels of depression and melancholy and superficiality. And there's some way of breaking out of that. And that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I get frustrated with in my engagements with and my own thinking through and reading the literature of leftists, and I mean like revolutionary leftists, socialist leftists, is I feel like a lot of times the elaborations of their goals and of their policy proposals, they don't take into consideration this libidinal level of desire enough, and that it's just all about some sort of like material overturning. And I oftentimes want to ask, like, okay, so what? So like, what happens after the revolution? And this is one of the questions that constantly comes up. Like, people do ask, what do you do the day after the revolution? But I think part of the reason that it's such a problem is that because a lot of socialist framing doesn't really consider the commodity form itself in relation to like the object cause of desire and the libidinal economy. And so I wonder if there's a way to supplement, like you said, if socialism is the cure in like political context, and obviously we're using that sort of metaphorically here, or maybe as a sort of image, like how could we buttress a sort of political or ethical framework with this desire for a cure in the psychoanalytic sense that wouldn't just be like that would appeal to people that are listening, that are like, yeah, I want to get out of this cycle of depression or this cycle of exploitation. Like, how do we marry those two together?
Yeah, I mean, so just actually as well, just for your listeners, maybe I should give a little very poor definition of the objet putia and what we're talking about there, unless your listeners are all
No, yeah, go ahead.
educated in their Lacanianism.
No, yeah.
Well, one of the ways that I approach it is actually with Freud, and Freud had a simpler way of putting it, where he talked about the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And the pleasure principle is ultimately what you want. So a kid wants to eat chocolate all day, climb trees, and win all the games that the kid plays. And then the reality principle is what gets in the way. So you can't eat chocolate every day because your parents won't let you. You can't climb all the trees you want because your body won't let you. And you can't win all the games you want to win because your friends won't let you. And we all face this clash between pleasure principle and reality principle. But most of us tend to think that if we could get rid of the reality principle and could just get what we want, we would finally be happy. But one of Freud's big insights is that no, we wouldn't. if you could have pure pleasure principle without reality principle, the things you desire would be robbed of their desire. You want to climb Everest and you immediately climb Everest. You want to eat all the chocolate and you can immediately do it. That wouldn't be heaven, that would be hell. That actually heaven is hell. And then Freud says it's actually the reality principle that gives things pleasure. It's the obstacle that, to greater or lesser extent, makes things desirable. And that we have to navigate this. And I think of that in terms of the objet putia, that in a sense, it is the obstacle to what we desire that causes us to desire it. Examples, a friend of mine always loves looking at houses. She's always looking at places, going on the internet, looking at magazines. And the thing that gets in the way is the lack of money. She can't buy the place that she wants to buy. But if she was ever to buy the place, what she might find is actually she got loads of enjoyment out of looking at the magazines, out of going and looking at the houses and fantasizing. And once you get the house, you no longer have the obstacle. So you no longer desire the house. The obstacle is actually the very thing that is sustaining your very desire for the property. So that's a way of, framing it for me. And we live in a society where we're constantly trying to get the thing that will give us pleasure beyond the obstacle. And for me, the cure is being part of a community in which we begin to learn that the object of desire and the object cause of desire, so the object of desire is what you want, and the object cause of desire is the thing that gets in the way, that those two things are tied together intimately. And so, in the words of Todd McGowan, we have to enjoy what we don't have, that we come to learn to enjoy the struggles of existence. And that doesn't mean we're happy with it. We could be very unhappy, and that's the difference between joy and happiness. Joy is a theological term for a type of pleasure you get in not having what you want. There you go. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that.
Mm-mm.
By the way, is Christological. This is why I call myself a Christian, is that Christ, symbolically in the Bible, is the obstacle to God, right? You have to crucify Christ. That's the whole point. We're going to crucify Christ and get back to God. So Christ is the obstacle that's getting in the way of the object, God. And then we discover that the obstacle is God. The very thing that we think is in the way of the truth is the truth. So it basically ties together the object of desire and the object cause of desire. So for me, Christianity expresses a form of life in which we enjoy trying to make the world more beautiful, all the while knowing and getting pleasure out of that struggle.
This idea of Christ being the obstacle to God, I'm hearing some Hegelian philosophy of religion there. Is there an influence there?
Oh yeah, very much so. Very much. And I feel like my philosophical and theological heritage is really that line from people like Hegel to Tillich, maybe Altizer a little bit, then into kind of some of the contemporary continental philosophers, Derrida, Zizek, and Hegel does lie at the heart of. I mean, to be honest, he's probably one of the greatest philosophers in the continental tradition. Anyway, I think analytic philosophers, some of them hate him, like Bertrand Russell. I think gave him one footnote in his whole book on the history of philosophy. So some people don't agree, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the famous saying is that Russell read that Hegel said something disparaging about mathematics and refused to ever speak of him again.
Is that right? Yeah, I thought he wrote him off with the two words category mistake, which I think he said Hegel's entire work is based on a misunderstanding of nothingness. So,
I find this so fascinating because I'm very much in step with a lot of your concerns, and we could probably talk for hours about like nuancing things and points of tension or disagreement that I think would be so fun to talk about. But unfortunately, this isn't really the domain for that. We'll have to do that over pints in Ireland one of these days.
Hey man, listen, and as I said to you the line, "You've been in Ireland for ages and you never went to Belfast." That is an unforgivable sin, my friend.
Oh,
So
even
next
I've been to
time,
Belfast
you got
often.
to
Are you
come.
serious?
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, he never went. He never went. He was in Dublin. I'll tell you, Belfast is the best city in Ireland these days. It is just killing it.
I
So
know.
we'll have pints in Belfast
That sounds
and parse
perfect,
this
man.
out someday.
And see, this is what people don't understand in either the Christian tradition that are kind of more evangelical, and then in like the hardcore atheist tradition that look at Christians like they're just a bunch of prudes. Real Christianity is done over drinks, man. Like that's where
Oh, yeah.
theology
Oh,
is done.
absolutely.
That's what real theology is. You get a little drunk, you get fucked up, and you say some stupid shit, and you're like, man, that's just life, and we should figure out how to incorporate this into our experience. I mean, that's what we do.
Absolutely. This is, I mean, it's a very Jewish notion, by the way. It's like, there's just very quickly, but there's a great story about this philosopher, a young guy in his 20s, goes to this rabbi and says, Rabbi, teach me the wisdom of God. The rabbi laughs at him, says, clear off. And the guy goes, no, I know Aristotelian logic. I know symbolic logic. I'm ready for the divine logic. And so the guy says, okay, I'll ask you a question. Two guys come down a chimney, and at the bottom, one has soot in their face and one doesn't. Who washes their face? And the guy goes, the guy with the soot in his face. And the rabbi says, no. He says, the guy without the soot on his face. He says, because he sees his friend has soot, therefore he imagines I must have soot on my face, and so he washes his face. So the young guy goes, oh, sorry, test me again. The rabbi says, okay, I'll give you one more test to see if you're ready for the wisdom of the divine. Different question. Two guys come down a chimney. At the bottom, one has soot in their face and one doesn't. Who washes their face? Well, the young guy goes, the guy without the soot in his face, because he sees his friend has soot, and the rabbi stops him and says, stop being so smart, right? Of course not. The guy with the soot in his face, he feels it in his eyes, he tastes it in his mouth, he washes his face. And then the guy's all bewildered. He says, one more chance. And so the rabbi says, okay, this time I'll ask you a different question. Two guys come down a chimney, and at the bottom, one has soot in his face and one doesn't. Who washes his face? And the young guy goes, was it the first guy for different reasons? And the rabbi says, go away. He says, no, they both wash their face. How could you not come down a chimney and not think you've got soot on your face, right? So this ancient Jewish parable I love, because it's like the young guy is a typical person, secular person, who thinks that being in theology is having all the answers. But the rabbi is saying to him, until you're willing to realize that this is a debate that's been going on from before you were born and will be going on after you're born, until you realize that this is an invitation into an ongoing conversation, just go away. You're too young. So that's it. Theology is an invitation into a never-ending conversation that has fighting and tears and laughter all as part of it.
Hmm.
I love that you bring up that Jewish parable, because it seems like rabbinic Judaism exemplifies theologically that idea so much more at its center than really any other, at least sort of monotheistic tradition. The idea that it's the conversation itself that's the important point. It's the struggle with God itself that's the important point, and not sort of some imagined, fantastical, ideal, utopian result of the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you'll know, like, some of the parables are actually when God comes in with an answer, the rabbis tell God to piss off, right? And God has to go back to heaven because God misunderstands theology. God is stupid enough to think that God has the answer, and the rabbis have to laugh at God and go, "You're an idiot. You think that there's an answer to this." So the rabbinical tradition has got some amazing stories.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, like I said, I'm in step with so much of this. I wonder for people who are listening, though, if they might say, okay, well, then this just isn't Christianity, because you're not talking about like going to the pearly gates and heaven, and you're not talking about affronting an evil God, and you're not talking about how I need to have a personal relationship with Jesus and all of these buzzwords and phrases. What do you say to that kind of person to invite them into it? Listen, this word isn't something we need to be afraid of. Like, join into this conversation to seek alleviation from the human condition in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I want to offer an alternative way of reading the tradition. And all I want to do, actually, for people who are listening or whatever, is go, if you're interested in hearing that, then, then there's plenty of places you can go, free content, you can hear it. But what I want to do is go, I want to offer an alternative reading of this tradition that's actually nothing to do with belief in God or angels or demons or anything like that. It's actually about transforming our way of being in the world. It's a religious experience, and by religious experience, I mean uh, not an experience of something, but what transforms your experience of everything. So a true religious experience isn't that I experience 10 things in the world, and then I have a religious experience, so now I experience 11 things in the world. A true religious experience is where you experience all 10 things in your world differently. So nothing changes, but nothing stays the same. That's what rebirth means, because you don't experience birth. Birth opens you up to experience. So I'm interested in going, okay, let's look at this Christian tradition. And by the way, I start at the very beginning. Right? Adam and Eve, right? Brilliant story, right? It's an Oedipal story. So the story of Oedipus that connects with some things we've been saying. So I'll just explain it in a nutshell. There's a guy who wants to sleep with his mum, perfectly normal, right? His dad gets in the way. He kills his father, sleeps with his mother, thinks it's going to be wonderful, but it's a disaster, right? Now, one way of interpreting that is to go, well, the mother is a symbol of oceanic oneness, returning to the womb, getting what you want, right? So the mother is the symbol of the mystical experience of oneness. The father is a symbol of what gets in the way of you getting what you want. And this kid breaks through the prohibition, gets what he wants, and it's a disaster. Well, that's exactly how the Bible starts off. It's with an Oedipal dilemma. Adam and Eve walking around the garden, then there's a prohibition, and behind the prohibition is a piece of fruit. And they think that if they eat the fruit, they will be like God. In other words, they will lack the lack, they will be whole and complete. They break through the prohibition, they eat the fruit, and it's not a blessing, it's a curse. So the Bible starts off with a perfect dilemma of what it means to be human. Is we're depressed if we don't get what we want, and we're even more depressed if we do, right? And in psychoanalysis, you have the superego, which is always saying, if only you do these 12 steps, then you'll be happy. If only you eat less, if only you have more sex, if only you're nicer to your mum, if only you hang out with better people, then everything will be great. And in theology, that's just the serpent. The serpent is the voice that says, eat the fruit and you will be like God. You will lack the lack. It's the voice that's always telling you that you have to do something in order to be happy. And the technology of theology is grace. And grace is the experience of not having to do anything, of being radically free from this frenetic pursuit of something that will make you whole and complete. So when you experience grace, you're libidinally disinvested from this frenetic pursuit of the thing that will make you like God. And in that experience of freedom, which can also be called forgiveness of sin, because basically sin means lack. And if you think about money, if you have a debt, you have a lack of money. If you pay a debt, you fill the lack with money. You pay the debt of £100. If you forgive a debt, you don't pay it. You just render it nothing. So forgiveness of sin means rendering the lack that is part of you into nothing. And that allows you to enter into a healthier way of life. So, I'm sorry, I know
No,
I went
it's
on
the
too long
negation
there,
of
but that's
negation.
just,
No, that's great.
exactly.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
it. And this is just to give your listeners a sense of going, oh, there's a whole different way of reading this entire tradition. So I just wanted to start with Adam and Eve, but
Yeah.
that can then, move forward into an understanding of the crucifixion. Because very quickly, the Temple of Jerusalem was a recreation of the Garden of Eden, right? 3 bits. There's the court of Gentiles. Everybody went in and you could hang out. A massive curtain. And behind the curtain, the Holy of Holies. This sacred object, the thing that will make you complete. And in Christianity, of course, the temple curtain rips and you see inside the Holy of Holies and you realize there's nothing there. So the nihilistic heart of conversion is the realization that God is dead, that there is nothing that will make you whole and complete. And that is good news. That's the good news of Christianity, freedom from the tyranny of happiness.
Oh, I think that's super interesting. Troy, do you have any questions on this? Final questions or comments here?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond for a minute to that idea of forgiveness. That just really encapsulates for me something that I always had a bit of a problem with, the sort of moral logic of forgiveness in evangelical Christianity, in that, the notion is that we're unable to pay the massive debt that we have because of sin against God. And so, Christ has to die so that payment can be made, since only God can make the payment. that God requires.
Yeah.
And that's not really forgiveness then, if you're actually paying the debt.
No.
Like,
Yes, that's completely different. Yeah. I mean, I think secularism is a form of theological payment of debt. So, for example, original sin, if you give that a psychoanalytic meaning, it just means that there is an original sense of lack. To be human is to feel that we are not reaching our potential. And then there's two ways of responding to that. One is all these people who promise that they can fill that lack, they can make you whole and complete, they can make you happy, etc. And the other is forgiveness of debt and the forgiveness of sin, which is simply saying, no, I'm going to rob that lack of its sting. That sense that you're not everything you want to be, we're going to turn that into something beautiful. It's going to be the struggle that animates your life, that gives it depth and meaning and beauty and vibrancy. You're going to move from happiness, which is the idea that you get something that you enjoy, into joy, which is the pleasure of struggle itself. And that's why I say the good news of Christianity is not you can be whole and complete and have the answers. That's bad news. The more you hear that, the more anxiety you get. The good news is life is difficult and you don't have the answers. And the reason why that's good news is once you accept that, you can turn that into something beautiful. So for me, the secular world is all about the payment of sin, but Christianity offers an alternative, which is the forgiveness of sin.
I like that little switcheroo there, where it's actually kind of modern secularism that itself is doing the classic traditional Christianity move. And we have to be sort of heretics against that.
Exactly. Every magazine you read is promising you wholeness. If you look a certain way, use a certain toothbrush, drive a certain car, have a certain amount of money. I mean, God, the theology. Now, and of course, I want to say not all secularism, but a lot of the secular world we live in is fundamentally promising wholeness and completeness. It's promising the payment of sin, and we need. I think psychoanalysis offers this. We need the forgiveness of sin, which means we need to enjoy the struggle of life and find freedom from this fantasy that there is some perfection out there. Oh, by the way, if I can say one thing about that, it's like,
Yeah.
it's not that you get rid of fantasy. If I can just use an example, if you have somebody who fantasizes about winning the lottery, and so they think, if only I could win the lottery, then I will be happy, all my problems will be gone. That's a type of fantasy that's destructive. That person will spend too much money playing the lottery. They'll hate their life. They won't look at things. They'll just use the lottery as escapism. And if they ever won the lottery, then, they may get a nicer bed and they may have a nicer air-conditioned house, but it doesn't get rid of the traumas that happen to us in life and the trauma that is life. But let's imagine somebody else who also fantasizes about winning the lottery, but they enjoy the fantasy. But if you ever ask them, they'll go, yeah, but I wouldn't really want to win. It would probably be a disaster. And the reality is money does not fix everything. They can still enjoy the fantasy, but they realize that the enjoyment is in not getting the fantasy. that weirdly, the worst thing that could happen would be actually winning the lottery. And that's partly what I'm saying is the rebel is the one who has a fantasy of a better world, but they get the enjoyment of fighting for it. And they also have the humility to go, and oh my goodness, if I ever got that perfect world, it would probably be a disaster.
There's this great story that Plato tells in the Republic. It's called like the Ring of Gyges, I think, by most people today, where I think it's Glaucon is the interlocutor with Socrates, and they're discussing whether or not people are sort of naturally vicious or virtuous or whatever. And this idea is if you got this ring, you'd put it on, you'd be invisible, sort of like Lord of the Rings style. And so Socrates asks, do you think a person would be more or less virtuous if they have this ring? Like, what would it cause them to do afterwards? And of course, the obvious answer is, well, they become more vicious, right? Because they would go and just satisfy all of their desires. Because being invisible enables you to, sort of do whatever you want free of any consequences, social consequences or otherwise. And Socrates kind of says, yes, but then they'd be miserable, right? Because they would no longer care about the satisfaction of these things anymore, because they'd be too easy in a sense. And so there must be some way in which, even rationally, we can realize that the satisfaction of desire itself does not actually bring happiness. And this kind of paradox of seeking out happiness through the satisfaction of desire, and that we sort of believe that one is constitutive of the other, but then if we think about it, we realize that it's not.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that basically there are two types of religion today, and there's religion of hedonism, which is any type of religion that promises the stuff that you want to make you happy. And then we'll call them religions of nihilism, which are religions that say get rid of your desire, divorce yourself from the frenetic pursuit of things. I give that up. And I think both of these are problematic. One is a religion of the pleasure principle, and one is a religion of the reality principle. That Kierkegaard was correct that Christianity is an absurdist religion, which is weirdly where it the absurd is the clash of these two things together. That we have to in some way inscribe the object and the object cause into our lives in a productive manner. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to explore.
Well, I guess to wrap this up then, for people who are interested in hearing more about this, where can they find you? I mean, you're kind of all over the place with books and YouTube and podcasts. How do you want to plug yourself so people can find more resources in their journey?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first place to go is probably some of just the podcasts I've done like this. I've done some podcasts with Rob Bell, also with the Minimalists and with Pete Holmes. And I think they're the best way to kind of start exploring this work. And then there's plenty online as well if that whets your appetite.
Great. And then your website, is it just peterrollins.com?
Yep, peterrollins.com.
Cool.
It used to be peterrollins.net. And on a podcast, I was bemoaning that I didn't have .com, and somebody bought it for me. So I was very happy.
Oh, no shit.
And now I have a .com. Yeah, it's lovely. Somebody said, I bought it for you.
Yeah, and now you're ever in their debt because they gave you a gift that you can't repay.
That's right. It's a beautiful gift. I'm very happy that I'm in the .com. I mean, .net just seemed like second-class citizen, really. I don't know. Never sat right with me.
Cool. Well, honestly, dude, thank you so much for coming on. I would love to have you on again to kind of keep delving into these themes little by little and scraping beneath the surface as we all kind of develop in our own processes here.
Yeah, listen, I would love to anytime, man. Love what you're doing. Love this idea of like doing what philosophy was always supposed to do, which is a technology of transformation, a technology designed to transform the personal and the political. So what you're doing is important. And again, just really pleased to be part of it. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. And enjoy LA.
Oh, I will do. Thank you.
Come on, I've got a day to discover you. Slaves getting paid, getting rich on days off.
All right, so for our next segment, and by the way, that was such a great conversation. I'm so glad that we had Peter Rollins on, and hopefully, it was as great to listen to as it was to actually produce. But we can't just stop there. We have a duty to continue on.
A duty to joy, a duty to salvation, a duty to the cure.
What's your sticky leaves, bro?
Oh, so I mean, I feel like I've got a lot of sticky leaves to offer, but I'm going to talk about now I'm not doubling up. This isn't a repeat. I know I talked the last time in my sticky leaves about poetry and how I'm liking poetry, but now I'm going to talk about something specific. So you got to just give me some leeway here.
I don't know, Matt. Is this following the Owls at Dawn parliamentary constitution? Because
I don't know.
Oh wait, there isn't one. We do whatever the fuck we want.
Ah, perfect. I am reading a poetic epic by Justin Clemens called the Mundiad. Do you know who Justin Clemens is?
I think I've heard that name, but I'm not familiar now.
So Justin Clemens is an Alain Badiou scholar. He is a literary theorist. He does a lot of work on psychoanalysis, and he's Australian academic. And there was a sale. It still is this bookstore here, but it's called Gold's Books, and it's been around for like decades, and it's a staple of the inner west in Sydney because the owner, I think he's passed away now, but he was like this old Trotskyist, and he has like this massive section of communist literature and like socialist economic literature. It's like this whole wall that was dedicated to that, as well as it just being this massive warehouse of books. And they're mostly used books and discounted books. But they were having a moving sale because they were moving from their location that they'd been at for like fucking 30 years or 40 years or whatever it was to a smaller place just because rent prices and things like that. and had this deal where it was $10 for a bag, and you could just literally come with a bag of your size. I mean, I imagine I couldn't come with my suitcase, but a carrying bag that you could come in and you just fill it up, and it was $10 per bag. So I went in and I just fucking loaded this up, and on a whim, because I knew the name Justin Clemens as a philosopher, I grabbed this book, and I really had no clue what it was, but I was like, fuck it, I like him as a thinker, I'll grab his book on poetry. And I thought it was like a collection of poems. It's not. It is his own like satirical piss take conversion of the poetic epics of like Milton and Virgil and Ovid and Homer. And it is batshit crazy, and I fucking love it. And it's called the Mundiad because he's playing on the idea of the word mundia being both world and also mundane, and that the mundanity of the world is sort of just something that we should explore rather than like Milton musing on the heavens and some sort of like theological narrative or something like that. So he tells a narrative through poetic verse, but all framed within the idea of the mundanity of the world. And it's fucking hilarious, and it's fun, and it's also really profound, and I think people should fucking read it. And like one of my favorite things that he does is, and I'm only like 50 pages into like 200 something pages, and one of my favorite things is he's telling this story, and it's this story about a nurse who is in a hospital, and she's stealing like pain pills and things like that for a little side job that she has. And there's another guy named Giuliano, and he has been beaten up outside of a bar because he was checking out some other dude's chick. And so he gets beat up, and he's like left on death's door. And so he's rushed to the hospital. And then this nurse is also doing her thing. And the nurse then gets caught by these like I don't remember if they were like medical students or who they were, but she gets caught by these two dudes, and so they come up with a bargain where they won't rat her out for stealing the drugs from the hospital, but she has to fuck them. So they go into like this place where they're gonna go have sexual congress, have this threesome, and they're in the middle of the act and they're having sex. But then he basically stops, and this is all told through like poetic verse. But then he stops at one point and he says, "But now I have to stop speaking in poetic verse because what I'm about to describe to you isn't even worthy of such beauty, so I have to tell it to you just in plain prose." And then he just goes into plain prose and just describes this threesome in like pretty graphic but kind of funny funny ways. And then after he finishes, then he goes back to verse, and he's like, "Now we can return to verse." And he goes back into verse again, and he's telling like this other stuff. And then all of a sudden he's like, "And now we return back to this like batshit story event where somebody like an orderly walks in and catches them in the middle of their threesome." And he says, "And now I have to switch back to prose again because this event is not worthy of the poetic muse." And so he goes back into prose and starts talking about how they're having sex, and the orderly disturbs them right before the dudes were about to come. And so then like she gets off the one guy's dick, and then she pulls the guy's dick out of her mouth, and she like falls over and bangs her head and cuts her eye open. But because of the startling gesture, both of the guys come, and the one guy that was sitting on the toilet, he comes on the guy's shoe, and then the guy that was standing up getting a blowjob, he comes in the other guy's face. Jesus. And this is all told.
This is not exactly Milton, yeah?
No, dude. And then that's precisely the point, is he's also using all of these allusions to, if you've read Milton and Ovid and Virgil and Homer, and he's using these allusions to them and their telling of their beautiful myth stories through their epic journeys. And he's kind of like subverting all of it, but it is this fucking batshit crazy tale. And I don't know, man. I just think it's hilarious, and I love it. So I think people should check it out.
Oh, that was quite the sticky leaves. That was not what I was expecting.
Bro, it is so. It's been my morning like meditation. I go to the coffee shop next door, and I get my my green smoothie, and I get a latte, and I sit there and I read like a few lines from this poetic satirical epic, and I'm laughing, and it's also really profound. Like the opening, the first, I'd say 15 or 20 pages are actually just these like really profound musings on the banality of the earth. And then it gets into the narrative, and actually the main character of the story is a woman named Mundiad. And the reason that he's setting this up is she is the child of Giuliano, the guy that was beat up for checking out the guy's chick. And then I can't remember the woman's name. Sophie, I think, is the woman who was stealing the pills. And they end up meeting each other in the hospital after this event. And it's actually because she gets all flustered and because that orderly disrupted that like threesome that was like blackmail, she kind of like rushes out and she goes to a place that she normally wouldn't have gone, and she ends up running into Giuliano and then taking care of him and nursing him back to health. And that's how they end up starting their romance, and then they get pregnant. And then they have their baby, and I think the baby's name is Mundiad. And I'm just getting to the point where they have the baby. And so like I'm just in the early stages, but it's such an interesting story because amidst all of this batshit crazy, weird, like formal stuff and these weird stories, there's also these wonderful musings about the state of reality and philosophy. And I just think it's I think it's fantastic, man.
You think you could do like a theopoetics in this domain?
How would it work?
I don't know. I was setting you up for some great joke about all that sexual innuendo we were just talking about.
Yeah, probably. I'm down. I mean, we could do it with like Lilith and how Lilith was kicked out of the garden because she wanted to be on top, and so Adam got pissed off because she wanted to be dominant.
Oh yeah, or right? Jacob wrestling with God, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of good stuff. There is fodder for material.
Yeah, has anyone done a homopoetics? That seems like an obvious avenue to make a few bucks.
I'm not a good enough writer to do it, but if I were and if I had enough time, I would do it. So I commission someone in the audience to do so, and then just make sure you give us acknowledgement in royalties, and then we'll be happy.
Yeah, do we want acknowledgement though?
Yeah, good point. Maybe not. So yeah, check out the work of Justin Clemens if you're interested in like psychoanalysis and philosophy and shit like that. But also check out the Mundiad if you just want like a romp through some strange poetic journey. It's fucking great.
All right, so that's it for us today. Before we head out, if you wouldn't mind going over to iTunes and giving us a 5-star rating and review, we'd very much appreciate that. It helps us get the podcast out to more people. You can also email us at owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. We've gotten some great emails lately, and we've tried to respond to everything, so we'll absolutely engage with you there. Where else can you find us? Oh, Twitter, at owls_at_dawn. And Facebook, I believe we have a Facebook page. Just search for Owls at Dawn. We've got stuff going on there. Anywhere else, Austin?
Nope. I think that's pretty much it. And again, Patreon. We're trying to get to the point where we can have like some better microphones. And ideally, I would love to be able to get somebody on that can edit the podcast. Right now, I'm editing every episode, and it's not that it's a bad thing. I actually love the editing. It just takes up a lot of time. So I'd love to get to the point where we can hire somebody to do that. But you know, it costs a little bit of money. So if you are in a position where you can support the podcast, if you're interested in getting access to the bonus podcast, if you find value in what we're doing, you want to be a part of the newsletter, or if you want to be able to offer up suggestions for future episodes, go over to Patreon and consider helping us out with that. And I'm going to be much more consistent with getting bonus content. And Troy's going to be freed up with a little bit of time here in the near future. So hopefully we'll be able to have him on more bonus episodes as well moving forward. So you can get out the access to that at patreon.com/owlsatdawn. And you can always check out our blog too, owlsatdawn.com. We blog sometimes. We don't talk about that, but sometimes blogs are up. Is there anything else we got to do, man?
Just one more thing, dude.
What's that, brother?
Das Vidania, Amerikansky.